Good morning. Everybody awake? You will be soon. Basically, I'm here just to help move things along. We're going to do short bios and then launch into a yummy discussion, and then we're going to open it up to you guys. And I urge you to ask the questions that are in your minds, unless, of course, they're classified. So come up with stuff. Don't be afraid to bang away at the door. So with that, let me just pass it off to my left.
Hi, I'm Doug Bryce, and I'm in DOD. I'm a retired Marine. I worked as a civilian for the Marine Corps for about 16 years, and now I've been with the Army for about 8. So most all of that has been in the chemical, biological, or radiological field. And so now I do the equipment side. I buy the equipment for all of DOD services. I look forward to speaking with you.
So good morning. My name is Ed Yu. I'm a supervisory special agent in the FBI's Weapons of Mass Destruction Directorate in the Biological Countermeasures Unit. I oversee programs looking at identifying current and, most importantly, emerging biological threat and biosecurity issues. Prior to joining the Bureau, my background is in molecular biology and biochemistry, and decided to hang up the lab coat and put on a badge, and very happy to be here.
Good morning. My name is Natasha Badge. I'm a senior research fellow at National Defense University. I've been working on WMD issues for 18 years. I spent some time in New York City at the United Nations. I spent the last 10 years at NDU, 3 years on detail to the Pentagon and the Department of Energy. But most recently, I'm leading a project on the impact of emerging technologies on weapons of mass destruction. It's been going on for a couple of years, and it will be going on into the near future. I really look forward to this discussion and to your questions.
Okay, the broad parameters here. We've talked about this, and since everybody knows that the Russians have decided to violate international law and use chemical weapons on a fairly persistent basis, we're going to leave it to the newspapers and the administration's statements to, because we're all pretty much up to date on that, right? We're going to focus more on the biological side because it's the one that most folks at the senior levels of the military and the IC think may be the greatest threat. And we want to hammer away at a whole bunch of thorny issues on this. And the first one I think that we can bring up is the basic issue of biological weapons as data. And I'd like you guys, maybe one at a time, to address the threat posed by that concept and how we can cope with it. And, you know, don't take more than like 3 seconds.
3 seconds. Well, I'll give that a start. So we've traditionally addressed the WMD problem as a physical problem, and what's happening now is that there are elements of that problem that are becoming digitized. Most obviously, additive manufacturing can digitize any object, turn it into a 3D design that can be sent around by email and then printed anywhere around the world. But also, every time we sequence a genome or a gene sequence, we're essentially converting that information into digital information. And that allows us to do the very same thing. And what that means is that states and non-state actors no longer need a physical sample to develop a dangerous pathogen. They need the genome. It's complicated, yes. You have to boot that DNA into a living cell and then get the cell to take it. But that fundamentally changes the problem that we have dealt with for many, many, many years. So it's a data problem that we're facing. On the flip side, there are solutions to the data problem, and machine learning, of course, is very much in the news. And in some ways, it's scary, and we're worried about AI and machine learning. But in other ways, it could become an extremely important tool for us to address these new threats. For example, in screening sequences. So rather than having people screen orders for sequences which cost money, we could have a machine learning tool kind of do the job for us.
So just for really quick background, if you think about biological threats, historically it's always been focused on the dangerous pathogens or toxins, right, the bugs. But as you aptly put, it's all about the data today. And just to kind of quick example, as was mentioned, your genetic code, the first time a human being's entire genetic code was sequenced was the completion of the Human Genome Project in 2003. That took 10 years and $3.5 billion to sequence one person's DNA. Today, you can do it in less than 24 hours, and the going rate is about $600, and it's dropping even more. So we are generating massive amounts of data, and we're leveraging that for really promising, powerful applications to promote health and address diseases. Even your health records, your whatever wearable tech or apps you have that track your exercise and your diet and sleep, all that is being leveraged to provide precision health. But it adds another wrinkle to security. That did you know that a majority of our DNA sequencing is currently offshored, right? Because a lot of the companies that are offering it, they're privacy compliant by today's regulations, but think about it from a security standpoint. And with that in mind, though, if you're a victim of identity theft today,
What country is it where most of that resides?
oh, so it's predominantly China. You might sign a HIPAA consent form and you're submitting a sample, and unbeknownst to you, your sample might be getting sent overseas for processing. But here's the issue, though, right? If you're a victim of identity theft today, for credit card theft or whatever, you can change your PIN code, change your credit card. Maybe the banking institutions might make you whole again. But if your genetic code is taken or sent overseas, or if your health records have been compromised, once it's gone, it's gone. And we're not thinking about what the long-term downstream security or threat issues are along with that. So that's a challenge that we're not thinking about today, but because it's definitely going to have implications tomorrow.
And the man who's going to protect us says,
So I think of the problem a little bit different. So it's nice that we can do all of these things in laboratories, but think of the policeman today, think of the warfighter today out in the field. They can't get that capability. It's terabytes of data that you're trying to suck through a pipe. It won't happen. So that's where I think some of our challenges are, is how do we get this big data to work for our soldier, sailor, airmen, and marine, our police departments, our fire departments, so that they can take advantage of genomic sequencing. It would be an answer in biological if you could genomic sequence where you're at and tell what's in the air, what's about to hit. Those are things that are extremely important. That is our future. That is something that we could strive to achieve and maybe get there. It's not the genomic sequencing part, by the way. It's the data part that we cannot get to. So it makes a huge difference. We're working it, but I got to tell you, I don't know the answer to the big data from the guy on the ground to get that information back so decisions could be made quickly.
why is it difficult? No, not why is it difficult, but describe why it's difficult to address this issue, and from your seat.
So the biggest problem is how we fight and how we go to war. And it would be the same if you're a policeman or a firefighter. We don't have large amounts of computers and laboratories and those kinds of things with us. We have basic radios. We have iPhones. We have things that have limitations to them in the battle space. And those limitations prevent us from either sending or receiving big data. So we have to find a way to get the data crunched and then send it in. So when you get to a certain level in the Department of Defense, or even in a police department or fire department, you would see that it changes. They do have ways to get to that data. But that is way too high of a level, and it wouldn't help those that are on the ground trying to prosecute the war or protect our streets. So it does make a difference.
Okay. One of the things we sort of rehearsed a lot of this before we came in, and one of the things we were talking about was...
I must have missed that.
You did. You were listening to the other panel. We were talking about the broader strategic threat, crops, herd animals, obviously human beings. And given the global nature of the data and the people, how do we ride this very dangerous animal to best effect?
Well, I'll just piggyback on what you said earlier. So it's one thing to have the capacity to send and transmit the data, but where's the data hanging out, right? If it's on the cloud somewhere, then you're talking about the cyber security. So the thing that we haven't spoken about, of course, is that we're here at a WMD event, and essentially we're saying that there's a huge cyber component. And currently, the U.S. government is organized to keep WMD and cyber pretty much separately. We function in separate silos of excellence. And so we're going to have to start rethinking that in the future.
And to sort of address the big question is that one of the things we have to recognize that there is so many beneficial and powerful applications that we can glean from all of this. And bio, unlike some of the other modalities, and this might get me in trouble with some of the WMD experts in the room, but bio is completely a different animal compared to chem and rad nuke. We're talking about, in chem and rad nuke, very specific materials that are of concern, that are already highly regulated and a very specific type of expertise.
And you can test for them really moderately easily.
But whereas bio is completely opposite. It's open source. It's widely disseminated. That's its strength. It always has been. So how do you address this strategically? And here's a shameless plug, that the FBI, we have positions called WMD coordinators. These are special agents that are trained in chem, bio, rad, nuke, and explosive matters. And the power of them is that there's at least one of them stationed in each of our 56 field offices across the U.S., and we also have some stationed internationally. And the reason why they're important is that they establish linkages with state and local law enforcement, with public health, with Interpol, with Europol. But the point is that for bio in particular, the best way strategically is to enlist the support of the subject matter experts themselves. So how do you raise a level of awareness and security sensitivities to a scientist working at a university, at a company, all the way down to a garage biohacker? And we've embarked on this for almost 10 years now, and listing them as partners. So not as the source of a problem, but absolutely part of the solution. And by enlisting the support of the citizenry is a really powerful way of looking at, if I coin a term from cybersecurity, what we've done is we've grown a population of white hats to be on the lookout for potential black hat activity. Because they recognize that, as you said, it has such huge implications to human, plant, and animal health. And they think it's antithetical that biology be abused or exploited. So they want to become guardians of the science. And as a matter of fact, that's been the theme of our outreach. We don't talk about biosecurity. The theme of the FBI outreach now is safeguarding science. And so we invoke their inner comic book heroes. How you can become a guardian of science.
I'm curious about, since we're talking about silos here, have you two dealt with each other before?
We have not, but I have dealt with many of the international and folks in the U.S.
Right.
That he is referring.
Yes. And again, not personally, but programmatically, as the FBI has worked with the CDC, with DoD through their cooperative threat reduction programs, with State Department with the biological engagement programs. So it is a team effort here.
So the interagency is working sometimes in some places, yes.
Yes.
And since you're the man who sort of comes closest to where the rubber meets the road of this group, do you need a lot more money? Could it be spent effectively, and how? You can include your budget request in an email to all of us later.
Sure. So I think that was, it's pretty well known that there's not enough money in this area to do the things that we need to do. That, I think, is pretty obvious, and it's pretty well known.
How stark is the problem?
I would say we're only halfway where we might want to be, and if we really wanted to go further, and I think of things like space and other places where we would want to invest, then you're probably only a third of the way there. So in our budget, so we ought to be looking at space all the way down, and what are we doing in the CWMD world to protect our nation and our soldiers, sailor, airmen, and Marines. So I don't want to go without saying we do get money and we do apply it. The research and development or the science and technology folks get their money and apply it. So we do the best we can with what we have. It doesn't get us to a challenge like the big data, taking genomic sequencing and putting it forward, looking at what will look through all the junk up in space to get to the Earth and see chem or a bio on Earth. Those things we still have not got enough money. Now we dabble in it, but not enough money. There's other mechanisms that we're using, so I didn't want to forget because it came up in the last one. We have a mechanism that we're using with industry, and it's an authority granted to DOD to have other transactional authority. And this authority is granted from what we call the S&T all the way through fielding of a piece of equipment. So in the department, I have the authority to create these, and we have created one for medical, and that is to get after the prophylaxis and the therapeutics, and we have created one for all non-medical. In that one for non-medical, we already have a huge effort with DHS. It's Bio 21. They're using that same mechanism. Our S&T partners use that mechanism, and I can pick it up from them. This transition thing doesn't have to be as big as it used to be. And oh, by the way, it's all about the industry partners. It's both traditional and non-traditional, and we're after more. I'll give you an example. Don't quote me on the numbers, but I'll try to get close. The Department of Defense deals with about 2,300 companies. How many are there in the United States, do you know? 23 million? Yeah. So just think of the ones we don't get to. And some of that's because we're DOD, of course. It's very hard.
What sane person wants to deal with the Defense Department's regulations when they can make money?
So I think that's a well-known thing as well, that in this OTA it cuts through some of that because you don't have to adapt to our financial systems, and it gives us a lot of authority to adapt to the commercial sector and laboratories and academia to get after problems. But that again, if you're going to solve these bigger problems, that would take the money. So I hope I didn't take too long, but to answer your question.
Now, I imagine everybody here appreciates the detail. Is there one thing that each of you thinks we're missing? And what is it, and how do we best address it right now?
Well, in the WMD arena, we're definitely missing the digital component. I mean, if you look out at the CWMD toolbox, our treaties, our export controls, PSI, all of those tools that have been effective for so long address a physical problem, and they don't consider the digital problem. And our adversaries are not going to look at the boxes that we put things into. They are going to look at opportunities, and if we're not watching the digital space, they're going to leverage the digital space, and they may go back and forth in ways that we can't now imagine to exploit advantages.
So I think one of the biggest challenges is, as I sort of mentioned it before, is that when we talk about biological threats, we tend to look at for lack of a better term, the traditional WMD threat.
Anthrax.
Yeah. But yeah, right. So, but if you look at where technology is taken, there absolutely is a convergence taking place, and a lot of it's going to be built on data. And the challenge I submit is that we are in the midst of a biological space race, and I don't think we recognize that. And the other sad fact is that we haven't been given the Sputnik wake-up call moment where we suddenly find ourselves behind the 8 ball, but it's coming. And until we recognize that we are in this sort of different race where it's not just a threat, but also potentially the missed opportunities do we suddenly find ourselves becoming marginalized? I think that's the threat that we also need to recognize too, is that not only do we how do we marshal and harness our capabilities to look at the traditional threats from a WMD angle, but then also looking at the term that we use is bioeconomy. Is what are we doing to protect our bioeconomy or even to reinforce it? And that encompasses looking at agriculture, additive manufacturing, health, alternative and renewable energy sources, which are all going to be a lot bio and data driven. And what are we looking at from a security standpoint today to not only protect it, but also ensure that we stay in the lead?
How important are universities to this basic issue?
I'll take that as a statement, not as a question.
All right, fair enough.
So part of what I think is missing, or our challenge is getting together and creating a multi-year plan and how we're going to attack our problem. If you have a plan, then you can try to put the resources, the people, the money against a plan, and you can try to get there. Coming down.
Are you talking about a government-wide plan, or, because, I mean, you've got a FITUP.
So a FITUP is 5 years, and if you think of this space, that's not much time.
Okay.
And so if I ask our research, our science and technology, or our universities or academia to solve a problem, they're going to take a couple, 3 years in solving that. It would take me maybe even longer to get a piece of equipment out. So the FITUP isn't our answer. It has to be bigger than the FITUP. It has to be a multi-year plan. So I'll be honest, I call it a 30-year plan. And if you have a 30-year plan, you can now find where you can plug in science and technology, where we can make the next generation move. When you look at the agents that we're after, it's first generation, second, third, fourth. What'll be next? The fifth? And so it doesn't go away, it just gets bigger. And so we've got to find different ways to attack the problem. If we keep doing the same things we've been doing, it's a good definition of insanity. So we've got to get better at how we attack this problem. The second thing I would say is machine learning and AI. So I've said it many times, if a soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine could say, "Hey Google," or "Hey Alexa," what's over the next hill, and you get back nothing, is over the next hill, proceed for ChemBio or RadNuke, then I think we're starting to get a place where we can get some projections going that would be useful for us in the future. So that's, I think AI and machine learning is a huge step for our world.
Why don't we open it up to the floor and see how good you guys are? In the back.
So I'm Sterling Thomas from Nobles. I want to ask you guys to talk a little bit about bioethics and some of the thoughts that we have. I mean, it's wonderful that in this country we have wonderful bioethics boards who make sure that we are not going to hurt ourselves or any plants or animals. But is that a limiting factor? And if it is, how are we going to deal with that, knowing that others who want to do us harm are not doing this?
Oh, so I love to tackle that question. So I will submit it to you that absolutely, in the U.S. we're really good about in ethics training. However, what we're talking about is not an ethical issue. What we're talking about is a security issue. So I'm going to pose a question back to you: is that, and part of this is that the FBI, we do a lot of academic outreach. We host biosecurity workshops across the country at different universities. But here's a question: so if suddenly, with the power of synthetic biology and other things, where now you have even elementary school students dabbling in bio, which is great. But across the board, how many students have ever heard of the Biological Weapons Convention? How many of them ever heard of the UN Security Resolution 1540? Right? We don't teach that. And I submit that's not an ethical question. It's a security education aspect where historically biology had been absolutely exploited and abused for offensive purposes. But we don't teach and we don't equip our students today about that. And so for me, that there's a disconnect that's happening. It's one thing that, yes, you can have very ethically minded individuals and they become very, very competent technically. But sitting where we are all at, we've seen the dark side of how bio has been misused, but we don't teach that. And I think that's a mistake. That's a gap.
Designer babies, yes or no? So I think what you're also getting at is that will other countries be constrained in the same ways that we've constrained ourselves, and how will that affect us strategically? And I would invoke Thucydides and the Peloponnesian War, and how much did Athens have to become like Sparta to fight the war with Sparta? Unfortunately, I think that we're going to have to look at this and we're going to have to think strategically, and that might mean that we have to change how we feel about certain things because the world is changing.
I think I would just add that we in the United States think that others think like us. I'm here to tell you they don't, and very few of them do. And so it's a problem that I think even here in the United States we have very controlled mechanisms when we're using animals or plants, right? Even in the space that we're in. So if I use them, we have to use them very ethically, and we have to make sure we're doing it all by regulation and law. Nobody else cares, right? Let's go to certain places in the world and they just don't even think about it. They think differently.
For perspective, let me ask the audience, raise your hands if you know what biopreparat was. Not that many. It's a really good example of this other perspective. Yeah. It was the Soviets' very impressive biological warfare center, which Ken Alibek back in the late 90s revealed in detail. And I was the guy who broke that story, not the New York Times. When I was at Defense Week, Judy Miller read my story, didn't credit me. That's how it goes. I'm not bitter. I'm not. I think it's just a really good example of this different perspective. Another question. Come on, guys.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to understand, in the context of countering the biological weapons of destruction, is human genome an issue as opposed to things like CRISPR technologies that modify genomic organisms, biosecurity? Where do you really put bioethics and human genome in the context of countering biological weapons of mass destruction?
So it's the valuation, right? So gene editing and CRISPR in particular got a lot of press. It's still getting a lot of press. But here's the thing: if you look carefully at a lot of the scientific literature, CRISPR still has its shortcomings, right? It's a powerful tool, but it is still just a tool. And if you read between the lines, if you want CRISPR-like tools to work even more effectively, you need more data. So bottom line, what these tools do, it incentivizes gathering more data. So if you want CRISPR to work better, you need more genetic data, genomic data at a population scale. That's how you overcome some of the deficiencies. So if you think about it that way, then suddenly it goes back to my prior comment. Who's tapped themselves into gaining access to that genetic data? And if you think about it that way, you suddenly start feeling a little uncomfortable from a strategic standpoint. So yeah, I honestly, I really don't care that much about CRISPR. It's a very powerful tool, but at the end of the day, it's what everybody already said here. It's all about the data.
This may be a reach, but the Anthem hack, for example, relevant to this?
So, yes, in a way. So Anthem, among other types of criminal cyber intrusions, what's the very first consideration that all of us think of? Is the threat for identity theft, right? For credit card theft or just the typical traditional fraud angle. But if you think about if you use precision health as an example, it's not just genetic information actually, because your genetic code doesn't change much over your lifetime. But in order to augment it, you need what's called longitudinal data over time. So this is your health records, your family history, what's your diet looking like, all of that. So with that in context, theoretically speaking, if you have access to some of those medical records, the Social Security and credit card issue is like, yes, it's important, but if you compare that to the access to the medical information, now you're talking about to the tune of potentially millions of Americans, their individual's medical condition, what treatments are being provided, what drugs are being administered, what does the drug course look like, potential insight into drug trial information. That biologically relevant data is far more valuable than the fraud angle that we typically look at. So it does put cybersecurity in a different light. It's yes, we ascribe security to financial information or confidential classified information, but suddenly your genetic code, which by the way is not really even covered by HIPAA, suddenly has some innate value. But we're not thinking about it in that security context.
I'll piggyback on that. Yeah. So think about a database containing hundreds of millions of genomes and what that would mean for medicine. So in combination with the lifestyle data. And that's all fine and good, and we all want diseases to be cured, but that's peacetime. Now let's transition to wartime. How would you view that information then? And that fundamentally changes the question because that kind of data allows us to target genetically.
Anything to add?
I would just go there. I think the same way. It's when you get into the wartime, all these things are good. Synthetic biology, all of them are really good, and they're tools that we can use for good, and they do help us. But you have to think about the ones that don't think like us, that might want to use them in a different light, and things like genetic cleansing comes into mind. With the information you can gain, you can control who you eliminate and how you eliminate them. So it's not a panic thing, it's just thoughts that it's possible.
On that cheery note, who's next?
Hello, my name's Kayla Foley. So you talked about that and you said, okay, you see those two opposite sides. So where's the happy medium? How do you use this data for the peacetime skills that you want to use it for, but also control it so it can't be used for wartime periods? Is there a way to do that?
And can you control it,
Yeah.
and should you?
I think you asked the critical question. I think we haven't figured that out yet. It's a challenge that U.S. Congress is just beginning to grapple with, and I'll pass it to Ed.
Yeah. So just the fact that you asked that question, we led you to ask that question, is where we all sort of need to be, right? It really is looking at cybersecurity in a wholly different way. And it is definitely, we already took you to a place where we're looking at biosecurity in a completely different way. It has nothing to do with viruses or bacteria or toxins, at least directly. But this is where we all sort of need to be. And if you think about the whole space race angle, is how do we get individuals like yourselves to start thinking about it that way, but in a much broader spectrum. And I do want to I don't want it to be all completely doom and gloom. But I do want to share some things because, as I said, we've been doing this outreach and engagement, so it's not just about a security awareness, but to sort of answer your question, what's the happy medium, is that the informed citizenry, we actually have college students who really take this to heart, and it's not just about ethics, back to that other question, they're taking it one step further, and they're now actually developing security solutions. So we actually have students developing tools that they can now turn and sell to companies to help them better screen, for example, if there's a suspicious order for a genetic sequence, they built a tool to help flag that. So can you imagine if there's a whole generation of students who are not only pushing the envelope in innovation, but then also leveraging some of that to help our respective agencies to better protect the country and our citizenry. That's where we want to be. It's how do we couple the innovation to also address the security issues, identify the vulnerabilities, but then also come up with the solutions.
Without killing the golden goose, right? Because yeah. I think everybody in this room who's paid attention to bio research knows that, I mean, saying the sky's the limit's a bit silly because we're here, but the ability to improve the human genome, the ability to improve our food stocks, our productivity in agriculture. I mean, it's mind-boggling over time.
It is.
And that is a cautionary tale, right? Because there have been historically, consideration for putting in, very conscriptives and security regimes on the life sciences communities. But here's something that you have to consider is that there already is a very, very powerful and effective, for lack of a better term, bioterrorist out there, and that's Mother Nature, right? So we just had a very severe seasonal flu last year, and it looks like it's going to be happening again. So get your flu shots. But if the question is that if we suddenly put in security measures that now hamper biological innovation, and you now handicap the ability to develop new countermeasures, new vaccines, new biodefense, new ability to protect our warfighter in theater, then that in of itself, if you suddenly hamper that, that becomes a different type of national security risk. So it is absolutely a fine balance. How do you promote innovation, but then address security that where one doesn't outweigh the other?
I can broadcast. Thanks. I'm Bill Lyerly. I'm retired from the Army as well as retired from DHS, and I've worked both the domestic and the international sides. When I lecture, I often like to say, drawing on Edward's comment a minute ago, that whether it's an act of Mother Nature or the mother of all terrorist acts, we have to be equally prepared. Having said that, everyone in this panel, and I would suggest that majority of the people here are from the counter terrorism perspective. How about the Mother Natures, the Ebola Health and Human Services, folks that are going to be involved at the county public health department? How do we, the old saying, everyone wants coordination, but no one wants to be coordinated. And so how do you bring all of these things? One of the programs that I had before I retired from DHS was we referred to them as smartnerships instead of partnerships. And it was basically strategically, directed mergers of organizations to accomplish a specific task. How do we pull all that together in the context of, rather than having two stovepipes, one for natural disasters, natural epidemics, pandemics, et cetera?
Maybe if I can refocus this a little, how good is the existing system from the local, state, federal, CDC, WHO system?
Right. So again, shameless plug. It's all about the WMD coordinators. So the FBI,
Without the FBI, we're finished.
No. I'll air a little bit of dirty laundry, right? So we had the remembrance for 9/11 just a couple of days ago. But then if you recall, about a month after that horrible event, we had the anthrax mailings. We had Amerithrax. And at the time, the FBI and the CDC, we were at loggerheads. Because one, what we tried to treat as a criminal investigation, they wanted to use it as a public health issue. And we butted heads. But since that, we realized that ultimately the goal is to protect public safety. And since then, the FBI have been working in partnership with the CDC, and what the WMD coordinators are now, if somewhere in the US, if there's, say, an unusual outbreak of some kind, whether it be human or animal, the coordinators are looped in, and we work together with the state and local public health. Because that way, through the information sharing, we rapidly determine, is this just a freak act of nature, unusual, or are there any indications of an intentional release? So that we've come a long way since Amerithrax. And actually that's a best practice that a lot of our international partners are wanting to learn. How do you bridge that divide between law enforcement and public health? Because you can't have that in an outbreak because that's precious time lost. Whether it be an act of Mother Nature or if there was some sort of state or non-state actor, you need to have that real-time communication between both sides. And that's been working very effectively, to great effect here in the US. And when we had that Dallas Ebola case a few years ago, the WMD coordinator was right there. But we played off of one another. When it looked like it just was a freak accident, then we stepped back. But throughout the course of it, we were there together with CDC, and that's where we are today.
I would add that I think if you were at HHS and DOD, they partner extremely well. So everything that I do in Ebola, they know about. Everything they're trying to do to help Ebola, I know about. And then we coordinate that as to which side of the medical community will do it. So public health ends up being our issue all the way down. If it's even a bio attack, it still ends up as a public health issue, right? So whether it's an indigenous disease or it's something that's been taken and put there, that is a partnership that we must continue. So there's a thing called the FMC. It's that is being reworked. I think we're waiting for Congress now to say that there are 2 voting members, and I'm not going to get into who's not voting and who is, but and the rest are advisors, and it ranges from everyone you can think of, the CDC to the FBI. All of them are on this group, and so it now boils down to what programs are we doing, how well are we coordinating them, and who's paying what bills. I'll tell you, I use them to help me, they use me to help them. So we're paying our share, or one of us is doing it for the other, or for both.
In case folks don't know, what does the acronym stand for?
So it's the Public Health Emergency Countermeasure. Yes, thank you.
There you go.
Sorry.
One more question, and then we got to wrap up.
Hi, Chris Royce from MRI Global. Just one thing that's not been discussed that you all have a effect on is attribution. And I know it means something different for every agency, but on the DoD side, we kind of go in and say, well, if you've got it, we'll go in and take it. There's very few, if any, successful prosecutions in this area in the DOJ. And then a lot of these treaties are looked at as kind of toothless. The bottom line is, what is the attribution mission or message of the United States government? Because when you mention biopreparat, that sort of ended basically with Secretary Baker telling Yeltsin, we know what you're doing, knock it off. Thank you.
I don't know how you answer that.
Right.
That's the problem.
No, but
It's not your problem.
But I take a little exception to your question, because if you look, there is public record that here in the U.S. we have something called the Biological Weapons Anti-Terrorism Criminal Statutes that the FBI is charged to enforce and investigate, and we have had successful investigations and prosecutions. Well, actually, majority of the subjects pled out because they saw the enormity of the evidence against them. But having said that, though, there's a difference between the variation in attribution is looking at implementation. So BWC and UN Security Resolution 1540 requires participating countries to have laws on the books and regulations on the books to prevent misuse of biology. That's great. But then comes implementation and enforcement. And again, this is something that we've been doing as a best practice, is that we have case histories and therefore case studies of how we put perpetrators behind bars. And that is something that we've been helping our partner countries too, is that you have the laws on the books, yes, but here's how you execute. So that's another variation that oftentimes doesn't get really talked about, because you just kind of check the box that, yes, we have the legislation. Great. What have you done for us lately? But that's something that, again, as I said, doesn't get talked about, but just do a quick case history and public records, and we have put quite a few people away under the BWAT statutes.
And there you have it. Proof the FBI is our only hope. Thank you all very much.